Good afternoon, and welcome to our New York Archives Magazine online speaker series. I'm Josie Madison, editor of New York Archives. Before we begin, we're pleased to share that we're moving toward a more accessible speaker series. As part of this effort, each speaker will briefly reintroduce themselves when they begin and provide a short verbal description of what appears on each slide. Today will be a thought-provoking hour with archivists Jamie Brinkman and Jasmine Bumpers as they share the story of Dorothy Franklin and Patricia Banks, two women who fought for inclusion and helped break the color barrier in the sky. Jamie and Jasmine will explore the journey of these women as they become pioneers in the aviation industry. Jamie Brinkman is an archivist in the Researcher Services Unit of the New York State Archives. She oversees the State Archives' digitization services and projects and provides reference support to researchers from near and far. Jamie has a master's degree in information science from the University at Albany and previously worked at the Harvard Law School Library and the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum. Jasmine Bumpers is an archivist in the Access Services Unit of the New York State Archives. She oversees the State Archives' online finding aids and catalog records, provides support to researcher services where she serves as an in-person and remote reference archivist, and leads the State Archives' Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion team. In addition to her work as an archivist, Jasmine is an editorial consultant for and a regular contributor to New York Archives Magazine. She previously worked at the Albany County Hall of Records and received her MS in Information Science with a concentration in Archives and Records Administration from the University at Albany. Tom Ruller retired from his position as New York State Archivist, a role he held since 2015. An active professional for 35 years, he's the author of several peer-reviewed journal articles and reviews on the use of technology in archives and the preservation of records in electronic form. Tom has been a consultant for several state governments and other organizations focusing on electronic records management and preservation. He remains actively engaged as a board member and steward of the Archives Partnership Trust. So welcome to those of you who have joined us today. We're excited about this program. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the presentation, so please feel free to submit your questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll set aside a little bit of time at the end to get to as many of those as possible. And now I am pleased to introduce Jamie Brinkman, Jasmine Bumpers, and Tom Ruller.
Thank you very much, Josie Madison. And hello, Jasmine. Hello, Jamie. Thank you so much for being willing to share this great story, and which is really a New York story to some extent. So much of what we're going to learn about today happened 20 years or 10 years long before the Federal Civil Rights Act and the creation at the federal level of the EEOC. And this is it's a wonderful sort of window on how New York could be a leader in helping influence significant and critical national policy. And it's great that the two of you have done this work and done this research to help us see really where New York brought that helped bring this nation to a much better place. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to I think Jasmine first. And you've got a PowerPoint that you're going to share with us. So I'm going to step back and let you tell this great story.
All right. Hi, everyone. This is Jamie. I'm actually going to lead us off today. Thanks, Tom, for the introduction. Jasmine and I are really excited to share the stories of these women who broke the color barrier in the sky. But before that, we are going to start off with a little bit of history of the State Commission Against Discrimination, whose records we used quite a bit in this presentation and in our article. So the roots of the State Commission Against Discrimination, which you might hear Jasmine and I refer to as the Commission or SCAD throughout this presentation, just so there's no confusion. It can be traced back to 1941. There was discrimination against minorities who were seeking jobs in wartime industries. So the Council on Discrimination and Employment was created. This was a subcommittee of the state's War Council during World War II. And during its existence from 1941 to 1944, The council handled over 1,000 complaints with a 95% settlement rate, which is pretty impressive. And those cases were settled by, quote, persuasion, conciliation, and hearings before the state's industrial commission. As the council was nearing its end, the governor at the time, Governor Thomas Dewey, requested that a temporary commission be created. He wanted some legislation to be brought forward. He wanted a commission to do some research for them. So in 1944, the Temporary State Commission was created to study the subject of discrimination and to make legislative suggestions that could be introduced later on in the state's legislature. The commission found and reported that they considered, quote, the lack of equal employment opportunity for minority groups the most economically wasteful and socially dangerous form of discrimination, and its elimination a sufficiently desirable and difficult task to call for use of administrative enforcement techniques untried in previous approaches to the problem. That last part is important. It'll come in play for our story. The report and findings of the Temporary State Commission resulted in the introduction of the Ives-Quinn Bill, or Act, in the legislature in 1945.
And I really like this PowerPoint slide that you just showed us, which is a wonderful timeline that traces time from 1941 to in the creation of the Council on Discrimination all the way up to the introduction of the Ives-Quinn Act. It's a great encapsulation of what you just said.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. And it's a very basic timeline to show, how we got up to the point of what we're going to talk about now, the passage of the law against discrimination. On March 12, 1945, the Ives-Quinn Bill was passed and it became the law against discrimination. On the left hand of your screen, you can see a screenshot of the opening part of that act describing what it does. And on the right are a few news clippings from around that time when the law was passed, talking about how it was passed, the State Commission Against Discrimination was created, and it was overall seen as a very positive thing. But the law against discrimination did two things. First, it aimed to prevent and eliminate discriminatory employment practices based on race, creed, color, or national origin. And it also created a state commission against discrimination. The law specified that the state commission was to formulate policies and make recommendations to other state agencies and officials. But to our story, one of the most important parts is that it also gave the commission the authority to receive, investigate, and hold public hearings about complaints that were filed about unlawful discrimination in employment. So once it was established in 1945, and as it moved on through the decades, the commission started working and receiving complaints about numerous industries, including the airline industry. On the screen is some statistical information I pulled from a study that SCAD did on the airline industries, complaints that in investigations that they held from 1945 to 1957. You can see that the number of verified complaints they received totaled 57. And of those verified complaints, 48 were due to color. Now, if you're bad at instant math in your head like I am, that is 84% of those complaints were related to the applicant's color of their skin. Of those verified complaints, those 57, 20 of them were about service positions like flight attendants or flight stewardesses, as they were known as in the day. So while this is going on, SCAD is also trying to work with industries, get them to, be better about their hiring practices. So in 1956, the commission held a series of conferences with representatives from 18 airlines that were operating in New York State at the time. The conferences resulted in a public pledge by the airlines to follow anti-discrimination hiring policies. You can see on your screen there's a little newspaper clipping. The governor at the time, Harriman, was praising the policy that came out of those conferences, saying it was good for progress and moving forward. Hopefully, we'd be seeing hires of people of color. The goal was to encourage employment policies and procedures that were fully in keeping with the state's law against discrimination. But while the policy was adopted, there hadn't been really any progress in applying those policies to the hiring process. And Jasmine is going to take over because this is where Dorothy Franklin's story really starts.
Okay, so this is Jasmine. And the image you see on the right is a photo of Dorothy Franklin from February 1958 that appeared in the Queen's Chronicle. So on August 29th, 1956, Dorothy Franklin, a 21-year-old college student from Astoria, Queens, made her way to LaGuardia Airport to apply for a position as a flight hostess with Transworld Airlines, also known as TWA, and that's how I'll refer to it throughout the rest of the presentation. She had heard about openings from the Urban League, which was a civil rights organization based in New York City. She was really excited because she thought that being a flight hostess was something that would be right up her alley. She worked as a clerk for the New York Public Library and was a former summer camp counselor, so she had a lot of experience working with the public. And she was later quoted as saying, and it's right here on the slide, "I like people and get along well with them and thought I would enjoy this kind of work." Okay, and on the next slide, you'll see on the right is a photo of or an image of a letter that was sent to Dorothy after she had applied for a position as flight hostess, and I'll get into the details of that in a second. So at the personnel office, she was interviewed by one of their representatives, Lucia Toscano. She was interviewed, filled out an application form, and was asked to take a preliminary physical examination and a general intelligence exam. The intelligence exam was pretty basic. It asks questions, for example, apples cost 10 cents, you have 50 cents, how many apples can you buy? So along those type of questions. Dorothy thought she did really well, and she thought that she fit all the physical characteristics that were described in recruitment brochures at the time for flight hostesses at TWA. So she was expecting that, she would probably get the job. But 8 days later, she received that rejection letter you see on the right, signed by Toscano. And basically, to summarize it, it said that she didn't meet all of their qualifications and that she would not be accepted as a flight hostess for their company. Franklin, Dorothy, she really thought that she should have gotten the job, and that she started to suspect that the reason that they didn't hire her was likely due to her race. So she brought all this back to the Urban League, told them how she was feeling about it, and they recommended that she file an official complaint with the State Commission against, I messed it up here on the slide, but the State Commission Against Discrimination, SCAD. And that's what Dorothy did. And on the next slide, you'll see on the left is a copy of her official complaint, dated October 17th, 1956. And on the right is a summary of the last part of it, where she says, "I am a Negro. I believe that respondent does not employ Negroes in the category of flight hostess, and I believe I was refused employment because of my color." So that complaint, along with a memorandum accompanying the complaint, was drafted by the field representative at SCAD who spoke with her, Sylvia Kuziel. That was all sent to another senior field representative at SCAD. Some people at the commission, they looked it over. They felt that there was merit to Dorothy's complaint, and an official investigation was launched later that month in October. And here is just a list of the people who I'll be talking about and who are involved in this investigation. So SCAD assigned J. Edward Conway as the investigating commissioner. Well, he was an investigating commissioner. He was assigned to head the investigation. There's a lot of other staff involved, but a Field Representative Harry Anderson did did most of the research and conducted a lot of the interviews that eventually were used in Conway's final determination. And the four big interviewees is obviously Dorothy Franklin, and from TWA, Jack Clifford. He was their Director of Industrial Relations for the company's Atlantic region. There's also Ramon Rivera from the Urban League, because remember, the Urban League was the one who referred Dorothy, as well as several other Black women at that time to positions at TWA. They also referred her to the commission. And then Richard Saunders, he was a photographer from Scopes Associate that the commission hired to take photos of Dorothy, which I will talk about in a second. So one of the first things that Anderson looked into when starting the investigation was TWA's qualifications for flight hostesses at the time. So in the center, you'll see those are a document listing the qualifications. On the left-hand side, I've summarized them. So basically, they wanted their flight hostesses to be unmarried, high school graduate with 3 years of college, between the ages of 21 and 27, 100 and 135 pounds, 5'2" to 5'8", and good general health. Most of these are very superficial, arbitrary qualifications, but at the time, it was perfectly legal for them to use these as measures to hire. And on the right-hand side is Dorothy's qualifications. So she was, in fact, unmarried at the time. She was living at home with her parents and two younger brothers. She was a 1953 graduate of Walton High School in New York City. She had spent 3 years at Queens College as a speech therapy major, while also working full-time as a clerk for the New York Public Library. She's 21 years old, 125 pounds, 5'6", had no chronic or acute ailments. So she basically hit all of these qualifications that TWA was looking for. And Anderson went back to Jack Clifford and basically told him that. Clifford's response, which we'll see on the next slide. He openly admitted that Dorothy did meet all of those qualifications, that she even passed the intelligence and physical examination, but that the reason they rejected her was due to her physical appearance, and that the TWA personnel representative who interviewed her, Lucia Toscano, found her to be unattractive, and specifically noted she said that she had a poor complexion, unattractive teeth, and unshapely legs. And on the right, you'll see the notes. These were notes that were that Toscano took during the interview, and I'll just read an excerpt right there. Urban League referral, two younger brothers, 19 and 16, complexion poor, teeth not attractive, legs not shapely. She called September 17th, asked if she failed the test, told it was not only test results, but all other factors. And SCAD looked into this, so-called reason, and just found there's just no merit to it. And on the next slide. So these were some photos. So on the left and right, they're both photos of Dorothy at LaGuardia Airport in a flight hostess uniform. These were the ones taken by Saunders for the commission. They wanted photos of her so they could, assess her appearance, especially an appearance, as she would look as if she was a flight hostess. And, basically they, as I just said, they just didn't find any merit to it. In the trial memorandum for the case, they actually note that, she had no facial blemishes, no disfiguring scars or birthmarks. In regards to her teeth, she had no dentures, no missing teeth, no gaps in between her teeth, no untreated cavities. And again, before I said she had no medical issues, they just, there was just no merit to this. And in the next slide, you'll see another photo of Dorothy. They took photos of her in a flight hostess uniform as well as in just regular clothes. And this is a quote that was taken from the memorandum accompanying the original complaint from the field representative who saw Dorothy, who also comments on her appearance. I'll just read the quote here. Attractive, graceful, well-groomed, and has a relaxed, easy manner. She speaks very well and is well poised. My impression is that she would inspire confidence in people. So The commission really thought that, Dorothy's appearance was up to par. And Commissioner Conway later stated in his determination that we are unanimous in our opinion that respondents' objections to complainants' physical appearance are not factually accurate and cannot be accepted as valid reasons for her rejection. But in addition to looking at qualifications and physical appearance, Anderson also dug into TWA's hiring practices at the time. On the left-hand side, this photo from the Museum of Flight is a group of TWA flight hostesses, all whites. And that was what the fleet looked like at the time, because never had the company in its 26 years of existence ever hired a Black woman to be a flight hostess. They had never even sent a Black woman to their school in Kansas City to be trained. They never even got that far. And it wasn't just flight hostesses. TWA had never hired a Black person to work in any flight-related profession in their job. So that includes pilot, co-pilot, navigator, flight engineer, radio operator, nothing. And when you add figures to this, it's even more startling. So TWA at the time, on a system-wide basis, they had employed 1,500 flight hostesses. And each and every year they had a high turnover rate. They were looking for 500. So they were trying to find 500 women to, work for their company each and every year. None of those women were Black women, not one. Despite, again, like as I said before, several referrals coming in from the Urban League, and I'm sure just people coming in, applying on their own. So this is all things that SCAD was noting and documenting during their investigation. So I'll talk about the determination in a second, but before that was drafted and a decision was made, SCAD was trying to come up with some sort of agreements, some sort of conciliatory effort between the two parties. They don't want to bring it to a hearing if it wasn't absolutely, I think, necessary. So they tried talking with TWA to see if there's anything that could be done. Conway asked Clifford if he would personally himself interview Dorothy. He did. He still said that her appearance wasn't up to par, but that he would maybe consider her to be a ground hostess if she could speak another language fluently. Which was a little bit of an odd request. Probably knew that she couldn't do that and threw that little stipulation in there. But SCAD noted that the qualifications for ground hostess were virtually identical for flight hostess, especially in regards to appearance. So if her appearance was up to par to be a ground hostess, it should have been up to par to be a flight hostess, which they still said she was not qualified for. Conway still continued to try to, have discussions, but TWA basically said, don't bother, that any, further discussions, the results would be fruitless. So they were done pretty much talking. So Conway was like, all right, you gave me no choice here. And he issued his, decision. He called for a public hearing. And here's a quote from his determination. I am of the opinion that when complainant applied for the position of flight hostess with respondent, she fully met all qualifications specified by respondent regarding education, age, weight, height, appearance, health, and being single. I believe that respondent's stated reason for not hiring complainant is merely a contrived excuse for the purpose of concealing respondent's true reason for her rejection, namely her color. He scheduled a hearing for July of 1957. The determination was issued in April, so a few months earlier. The hearing though was canceled and rescheduled quite a bit. TWA wanted new management, and perhaps knowing that the hearing wouldn't go into their favor, they probably started, for those reasons, restarted negotiations and discussions with the commission. And eventually in February of 1958, they announced that they would be hiring a Black woman as a flight hostess within the next 90 days. And as a result of that decision, Dorothy Franklin decided to withdraw her complaints, so the hearing was officially called off. In May of 1958, they hired Margaret Grant, who you'll see on the left there, and on the right, side as well, and some newspaper articles on her from the New York Age and the Punxsutawney Spirit. She was a 21-year-old psychology student from New York City who attended Hunter College. The decision was hailed by yeah, the decision was hailed by newspapers, civil rights organizations across the country. Everyone was really happy and excited that a major U.S. commercial airline was finally taking a step to hire a Black flight hostess. Unfortunately, while she was in the training school, they discovered that she had sickle cell trait, which I won't get too into medical stuff here, but she was basically a carrier for sickle cell anemia. And though she was asymptomatic, being in the air and flying regularly could cause some health concerns and health problems. So she was medically disqualified. The company did say they would hire another Black woman to replace her. Took a while, but the following year they did do that. They hired the woman you see here, Mary Tiller. The center is a ebony feature on her, the ebony cover, and then the feature on the left and right. She was a 22-year-old math student from Kansas City, Missouri, studied at UCLA. She went through the school successfully and became the first Black female flight hostess for a major U.S. commercial airline. She was stationed in Kansas City, flew to places like Cincinnati, New York City, DC. So mostly above the Mason-Dixon line, mostly in the north. As a result, she didn't report having too many issues. She really enjoyed her time there. She got married 3 years later, 1962. And because of a requirement at the time for flight hostess to be unmarried, she would have had to given up her position with the company. So she at most lasted maybe 2.5 years in the position. So not very long, unfortunately. And Dorothy, even after she had withdrawn her complaint, she still wanted to be a flight hostess. But she also, in a letter to SCAD, informed them that part of the reason she wanted to file this claim was to open up opportunities for other Black women to get positions. So even though she herself wasn't hired, she felt that that second part of her initiative was achieved. So she still felt good about how things ended. And here's a quote from her with a picture of her on the left. The important thing is that a Negro stewardess will be hired. It should have been done long ago. All right, so now I'll bring it back to Jamie and discuss another woman who helped to break the color barrier, Patricia Banks.
Thanks, Jasmine. The keys for my presentation are being very sticky, so I apologize for the flashing of slides on your screen, everyone. Apologies. So like Dorothy Franklin, Patricia Banks was a Black woman in her early 20s. She was a 22-year-old evening college student from Queens, New York. She was a business machines operator at Consolidated Edison at the time, or Con Ed as we all know it now. She was flipping through a fashion magazine one summer, and an advertisement for a school by the name of Grace Downs Air Career School caught her eye and thought that it sounded appealing to her. She wanted to become a flight attendant because she, quote, loved dealing with people very much and liked to fly. And later, in subsequent interviews that she has given since these events, she said that she later noted that, quote, African Americans back in those days, people didn't have the opportunity to travel that much. So when I saw the article, I said that that would be a great opportunity. So a little bit about the school, the Grace Downs Air Career School. It was a New York City-based school that had been founded by Grace Downs, who was one of the first magazine cover girls. And while her schools were initially charm schools, they expanded into airline and secretarial schools. Coursework for flight attendants included time zones, meteorology, airline codes, emergency procedures, and first aid, things like that. During their coursework, airline representatives would come to interview students for postgraduate positions with them. And on your right hand of your screen, you can see a few advertisements I pulled from Mademoiselle magazine. At the time, Banks would have been flipping through those magazines herself. The advertisements boasted of a 99% placement rate, which is pretty nice for if you're looking for a post-school job.
I love some of the headlines of those ads. The airlines need you. You know, everything I wanted came from going to this school. It says something.
Yes, their marketing department was working hard. But anyways, after applying and interviewing, Banks started her 3-month course at the school in July of 1956. You can see we have a picture here of her on the right hand of your screen. She was interviewed by 2 representatives of Capital Airlines in August of that year. And while she initially received a B+ score, it was changed due to a tooth that was in need of fixing and lack of experience working with the public. Now, Patricia Banks fixed her tooth, which, by the way, was a back tooth that really couldn't be seen unless she was smiling wide. And she also felt like she had the experience working with the public that they were arguing she didn't. Before her position at Con Ed as a business machines operator, she had worked at a luncheonette where she was frequently working with the public. So typically a woman like Banks that was marked as, quote, would see again, would be given a chance to re-interview. However, she was subsequently denied follow-up interviews despite fixing her, quote, issues. So on the recommendation of Congressman Adam Clayton Powell Jr., she filed a complaint with the commission against Capital Airlines in February of 1957. So upon receiving the complaint, the commission launched an investigation to determine whether or not Banks's complaint was valid. Similar to the numbers that Jasmine showed you about TWA, Capital Airlines, out of the 1,350 flight-related employees, none of them were Black at all in any of those positions. And there was also a turnover rate of 40% for flight attendants every year, leading to many positions being available. They needed women to serve those roles. The investigation also found that some women were interviewed up to not 1, not 2, but 4 times before being hired by the airline. And most importantly, the investigation found that Banks's complaint was valid, and therefore a public hearing was to be ordered and held in July of 1959. So you can see on your screen, there's 2 images. There's a newspaper clipping on the left that describes the scene of the public hearing of Banks giving testimony. On the right is a picture from the public hearing that was in a newsletter from the commission at the time. Pat is sitting in, she's kind of underneath the American flag. She's sitting there giving her testimony to the 3-person commission. But the public hearing featured multiple days of testimony from Banks, SCAD investigators, and representatives from the airlines. It was revealed during the testimony that several white women who had never graduated from a flight career school or had public work experience, like Patricia Banks had been hired by Capital as flight attendants. Additionally, SCAD's investigator affirmed that other students of the flight school who were white were given multiple chances to re-interview after addressing the issues that the airline brought up. The 3-member commission had 40 days to make a decision regarding Banks's complaint. It took a little bit longer than 40 days for the commission to come to a decision, but in February of 1960, they issued the order. And on your screen, you can see a copy of the order. This is actually not held by us here at the State Archives. This is something that's available from the Smithsonian. It's available online in their digital collections. The commission found that Capital Airlines had committed unlawful discriminatory practices under Section 296.1, subsection A of the state law against discrimination, quote, in that respondent has refused and still refuses to hire or employ complainant as a flight hostess because of her color, and further in that respondent has maintained and still maintains a policy of barring Negroes from employment because of their color in all flight capacities, including that of flight hostess. And I have a few closer screenshots of the order of particular pieces that are important here. But the order also included requirements related to hiring Patricia Banks and Capital's hiring practices overall. So that top portion you see are the parameters that were required to hire Banks. So if she could pass Capital Airlines' usual 2.5-week course, pass the usual IQ tests, and pass the indoctrination course for flight hostesses, that all of those that were held at the time of her initial interview back in 1958, apologies, then they were required to hire her. It also required that staff at Capital Airlines and Grace Downs be instructed and required to comply with the law against discrimination, which meant that they had to hire applicants for all flight positions who were recruited, trained, and selected within the state of New York, solely based on the merit and without regard to their race, creed, color, or national origin. That little blurb about within the state of New York is pretty important because at one point, Capital Airlines tried to argue that since they were headquartered outside of New York State, that they were within their means of, performing their typical hiring process. But New York State said, no, you have a hub here, you employ people through here. This law applies to you. And there's a little bit of a side story, but if you look it up, there's great footage out there of Pat Banks talking about finding out that she had won her complaint against Capital from a member of her own community. She had been sitting on a bench waiting for a bus when the owner of a convenience store popped their head out and said, Pat, you won. You won your case. And when she got home to share the news with her mother was saying, yes, I already know, the phone's been ringing off the hook nonstop. It's really great footage if you get a chance to look it up. So after a 3-year battle, Banks was hired by Capital Airlines in May of 1960. She would serve as a flight attendant for 1 year before resigning. Throughout the years during interviews, she's noted a few factors that led to her resignation. She faced racism flying through the southern part of the United States. That's where she had been assigned for her route. She also had a lot of internalized pressure on herself. She felt like she needed to be perfect so she wouldn't ruin future opportunities for other Black women who might want to follow the same path that she did for a career. She also wanted to continue her education, which she did, and she obtained her degree in psychology. Banks would spend the most of her remaining career in the fields of addiction and rehabilitation, even serving as a fellow public servant with the State Office of Alcohol and Substance Abuse Services, which is today's Office of Addiction Services and Supports, during the 1970s. She also remained involved in the aviation field as well. She served as part of the board of directors for the Black Flight Attendants of America, and she was inducted into the Black Aviation Hall of Fame in 2010. Patricia Banks and Dorothy Franklin's fights were steps towards progress in ending discrimination in hiring, but Jasmine is going to talk about what happened next and where things stand today.
Okay. So a few years after Patricia Banks won her battle against Capital, Federal legislation was finally passed. Um, Civil Rights Act of 1964, you'll see on the right-hand side is a little excerpt, and then on the left is some summaries of the big points of it. So it did a lot of things, but I'm going to focus on the points related to employment. So the act prohibited employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, and national origin at the federal level. So basically, like a federal version of the law against discrimination. Which was definitely a lot, very, very helpful. New York was the first, and there's a couple of other states that kind of followed suit. But for Black women to obtain these jobs, they had to, reside in these states, file these claims, and it was difficult because, as Jamie mentioned, a lot of them tried to say, "Oh, we don't hire here; we hire elsewhere," where there isn't a law in the books. TWA did the same thing. So um, now there's an official federal law. And unlike the law against discrimination, an amendment was added to this one that included discrimination based on sex, which made it illegal for airlines to require women to be unmarried and to not have any children, which was also big barriers for all women in maintaining or having long careers as flight hostesses. Especially hard for Black women because now they're a double minority. And even when they did get their footing in there, maybe they did want to stay and have long-term careers, they couldn't because a lot of them were getting married. Um, you also couldn't work past the age of 32 as a flight hostess at that time. So there was a lot of barriers there. And this helped a little bit of that, alleviate a little bit of that. The act also called for the creation, as Tom mentioned earlier, the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which was very SCAD-like. It had the authority to investigate complaints, which, was definitely very much needed. Just because there's a law in the book doesn't mean people are going to be willing to follow it. So they need some kind of enforcement part, and that was the commission. And progress was starting to be made. You can start to see shifts in how these companies were advertising. So here you'll see a TWA flight hostess brochure from the 50s. A lot of white women are on every single page here. And then on the next slide, you'll see some from the 60s and 70s. These are examples from the Museum of Flights. We have TWA, American Airlines, and Continental Airlines. And you'll start to see they're more diverse. There's Black women popping up. They're trying to appeal to more people in regards to hiring. And, there was some changes that were starting to be noted. By the early 1970s, about 1,000 Black women were now flight hostesses, which is still very small. It's about 3% of the population of flight hostesses, but compared to 3 or 4 from the early 60s, it was definitely a big improvement. And that number has steadily increased over the years. By 2022, the US Census Bureau reported 14.2% of Black men and women make up the population of flight attendants. And the numbers have readily increased for other racial and ethnic groups as well. So still a predominantly white field, but there has been, like I said, some very big improvements over the years. And just going to end with one more slide here. This was sent to Dorothy Franklin from SCAD Chairman Charles Abrams. It's a letter. And it's just basically thanking her for her service, helping to eliminate discriminatory practices and helping to open up the airways. And I just have a quote here that I really liked, that as these barriers continue to be broken down, I hope you will derive continual satisfaction in knowing that you played an important part in bringing the American community closer to the ideals on which America was founded. And I think that's just a little good reminder, especially I think with this year being the 250th anniversary of the revolution, remembering that did not, help everybody at the time, and that there was continued revolutions throughout the decades, and that this was one of them, an important one, and one I hope people don't forget. So, there we go. And these are just a list of some of the sources we use. Most of the records came from the New York State Archives, a couple of things from the New York State Library, and a couple of other secondary places.
Wow. Thank you. Jasmine, I really appreciate your point about looking back at the 250th anniversary of the Revolutionary War. And some people talk about really we're celebrating the anniversary of the American Revolution, which is a revolution that continues to evolve and continues to move our whole country forward in a positive direction. And that story and that quote really brings that home to me personally tremendously. So thank you for very much for that. I have just one quick question. We've got a few questions that have piled up, so I don't want to uh, take up too much time. But the simple answer, why didn't TWA just go ahead and hire Dorothy and sort of solve the problem right away in those negotiations? Do you have any, can you speculate on that a little bit?
Yes, I can definitely speculate. I don't know for sure. But I did find it interesting that the women that TWA did end up hiring, first Margaret Grant, and then when she became ineligible, Mary Tiller, was that, they were both light-skinned women. And Dorothy Franklin, she had darker skin. And I did wonder if that had something to do with it. A perceived on the part of the company's proximity to whiteness. Like if they're going to pick somebody, like those two, as opposed to Dorothy, who was darker skinned. So that's something I was kind of thinking about. And I think it's an issue that still comes up and is relevant today, inside and outside of the Black community too. Um, Sort of, light versus dark. So I don't have any official reason, but that's sort of what I suspect is that her skin tone had maybe something to do with it. Because on paper, they're all very, very similar college students around the same age.
Mm.
Um, there really didn't seem to be a reason that they couldn't have just used her. So that's my thoughts on that.
All other factors being equal, that's the only factor that sort of separates Dorothy from the other women. That's a really, really insightful point. I liked your list of records and resources at the end. Again, the Division of Human Rights, which continues to operate here in New York, is the sort of carrying on the legacy of SCAD. And those records are in the archives and available for research. So I'm guessing there are other stories in other industries or other areas that might show up in some, particularly some of those earlier records, the prior to 1964. Would that Are those records accessible for people to use and do research in?
Yeah, I can take this one. This is Jamie. They are accessible, especially some of the older cases, like Tom said, that were pre-Civil Rights Act. Just given age, things are a little bit more disclosable according to law. But there are a lot of great stories in the records. Jasmine and I were just really lucky to find the stories of the flight attendants in the records when we were doing other work and realized what we had on our hands, and we're able to share that with everyone. But there are definitely some other important cases that are in there, that are waiting for researchers to use them for their own academic or just historical interest purposes.
Well, and to show how the revolution continues and starts to envelop other people from different races and ethnicities. So wonderful. I think there's some questions piling up, so I'm going to turn it over to Josie, and maybe we can talk about a few of these.
Yeah, so there have been some questions, and you were talking a little bit about the other stories that might be able to be found in these early records of the SCAD. Um, did you come across anything about other racial or ethnic groups experiencing the same kind of discrimination in this industry?
I can start. This is
Sure.
Jasmine. I personally haven't gone specifically looking for other cases. For other racial and ethnic groups, I haven't. I have found more cases regarding Black women and women in general, though. I did see a case for a Black woman who was dismissed for basically being pregnant. Um, Another big, big case in regards to the age requirement I mentioned before about having to retire at 32. That became a big thing, and there's some records on that. There probably is. I just haven't attempted to find or to look for any right now. Maybe Jamie has. I'm not entirely sure.
Nothing comes to mind. Jasmine brought up some really good examples. Like I said before, sometimes this is part of our job as archivists are making records accessible. That's what we do a lot during our day-to-day basis. And sometimes we find stories like the ones of Dorothy Franklin and Patricia Banks, and we get to go down those rabbit holes, if you will, to really dig in and research what we have is related to some of the records.
And I'll offer that what you do, though, is you highlight the value, importance, and stories that are contained within sometimes very large collections of records. And the State Archives is open and accessible to anyone, and researchers can come and use those records. And so what you do is highlight maybe one story and encourage others and show others that there's an opportunity to tell many, many more. So thank you for what you did. Josie, back to you.
Yeah, I would echo that sentiment. It's always great to hear from you, the archivist, when you come across something that's of interest because you know the records better than anyone. Um, so we do have a question also about, and I don't know if you came across anything about this either, but was there similar discrimination among pilots? Did you happen to come across anything about that?
There was, and I only can speak on it very briefly, but in those newsletters, I think it flashed across the screen during our sources page, but we do have a series of newsletters that were produced by the State Commission Against Discrimination and later the Division of Human Rights, which it morphed into. The newsletters mentioned specifically that a Black man was hired as a pilot, and that was big news because, like Black women who are trying to become flight hostesses, they really struggled to break the color barrier there as well.
This is Jasmine. I'll just add to, I brought it up during my presentation. TWA had no Black employees in any flight capacities, and they weren't an outlier. There was, many airlines had, similar issues. So there was trouble obtaining jobs across the board in regards to flight positions for Black women and men.
Yeah, and then I think one of our questions kind of gets at an overarching story here about the way that positions in the airline industry have changed over time as far as discriminatory practices. Um, as Jasmine, you were mentioning that women couldn't work as flight hostesses past the age of 32. A lot of those rules have changed. You now see more men in those positions. So there is kind of an overarching story about changes within the airline industry. And are there any like secondary sources that you used when you were looking at this that might help people understand that larger story?
Miss Jasmine, most of the records we consulted were stuff that was in the New York State Archives that was created by SCAD, or the precursor to the Division of Human Rights. Newspaper articles also really helped fill in a lot of gaps. These were stories that were really well covered at the time in which they were happening. And those were I would say the records that I used the most.
Well,
I
I
think
think,
newspapers are a great point, that a lot of times you can get that story from newspapers.
yep.
Sorry, Tom.
And this is Tom. And I think one of again, the benefits of telling this particular story, which is really tracing a complaint within a state agency that had a tremendously positive impact, gives the fodder for an academic or someone to write that definitive overarching book. And here's the data and the evidence that you can use to tell that story and back up what you're talking about. And this applies to the airline industry and one particular small group of individuals but they're part of a larger thing. And it also applies to the airline industry as it operated in New York State. It would be interesting for someone to look at airlines that operated out of other places, Delta operating out of Atlanta, or Southwest operating out of somewhere in Texas, those types of things, and how the broader industry needed the federal law to make the change. But here in New York, we tried to address it. We only have a minute or two left, but I think one of the things we want to point out is for teachers and students, there's some great resources, and scans of and teacher classroom aids for all of these documents are available on our Consider the Source platform, the State Archives, our Partnership Trust Consider the Source platform. Is that right, Josie?
Yes, so there are lots of scans of documents and resources for educators to help use those documents in their classrooms. Those are at considerthesourceny.org. You will also get a link to those when you get a thank you email after the presentation wraps up. You'll be receiving a thank you email with some links to resources, and that will be one of them. And that's also it's one of the ways that we're highlighting this story, but there's also an exhibit. And Jasmine, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so starting or for the months of February and March, Jamie and I have curated a joint Black History, Women's History exhibit opening the Airways. So it's basically an in-person version of all the records and more that you saw scattered today throughout our presentation. So if you're in the Albany area, please stop by the Cultural Education Center and come up to the 11th floor and check out all these records that you saw in person. Um, and yeah.
So yeah, I think there's a lot of resources available. This is a great story. It's just kind of the tip of the iceberg. Maybe there's somebody listening today who wants to write that book about, how the airline industry changed, and you want to use the really valuable resources that Jasmine and Jamie have identified in the State Archives collections.
And this is Tom. And in the meantime, you can read this story in the most recent issue of New York Archives magazine. And if you're not a subscriber, you'll find out some more about how to get the magazine when that material that they're going to send out after this program.
Absolutely. So thank you so much, Jasmine, Jamie, and Tom for joining us today and for presenting this information. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. If you're interested in learning more about the records of the New York State Archives, you can visit that website at archives.nysed.gov. And if you're interested in learning more about what we do at the Archives Partnership Trust, our website is nysarchivestrust.org. It's our privilege to make these events available to you and to keep New York State's history alive. If you're interested in the content we create and you have some great ideas for future programming, please drop us an email at aptrust@nysed.gov. And as we mentioned, a recording of this session, along with resources, relevant links, and also registration for our next online speaker series are all going to be in your thank you email that you'll be getting probably within the week. And please don't forget to join us on February 10th at 12:30 for our next online speaker series, The World's Borough with Lawrence Samuel. You can find out more about that program and register for it for free at nysarchivestrust.org. Thanks again, Jasmine, Jamie, and Tom.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Stay warm, everyone.
You too.